Welcome to Unit 1. Today we're going to be talking about perfect squares and square roots. You're going to need your calculator for this, so if you don't have it, you want to go ahead and grab it. And let's get started right now. Here we are at perfect squares and square roots. Let's take a look at some key ideas. So a couple of key ideas we have here. The first one is, what does squared mean? When we talk about squared, that means a number times itself. Then we need to take a look at what does square root mean. And square root means that any number which when multiplied by itself equals the number. Let's take a look at a few perfect squares. So here we're looking at a couple perfect squares. Now's a very good time to have our calculator. We can use the calculator to figure out what 1 squared is or the square roots are. So we're going to go ahead and fill in as we go about with our calculator. So 1 squared, or 1 times 1, is 1. Also, if I find the square root of 1, I know that's going to be 1. I have 8 squared. 8 times 8 is 64. And the square root of 64 is 8. Then I have 3 squared. 3 squared gives me 9. The square root of 9 is 3. 13 squared is 169, and the square root of 169 is 13. So notice that the perfect squares, the squared and the square root equal the same type of number. So 1 squared is 1, and the square root of 1 is 1. 3 squared is 9, and the square root of 9 is 3. So they are corresponding. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next one. So now that we've seen a few perfect squares, let's take a look at the definition. A perfect square is a whole number whose square root is an integer. A perfect square cannot be negative. That's important to know. Let's take a look at practice number 1. So practice number 1 says, which of these are perfect squares? So since this is practice, I want you to be trying this on your own. Go ahead and pause the video now, then press play again to see if your answers are correct. How did you do? Were you able to find all of the correct answers? If you were, great. If not, go ahead and make sure that your paper now looks like mine. Remember that square roots can't be negative, so you can't have a number times itself and get a negative answer. Negative 10 times negative 10 is going to give you positive 100, not negative 100. So you can't really have a negative perfect square. So these are our correct answers. If your paper doesn't look like mine, go ahead and make that happen now. Let's move on to example A. Let's take a look at example A. Example A says, place each of the following square roots on the number line. So we've got the square root of 2, square root of 70, and so on. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to figure out what those square roots are. Rather than just trying to guess where they'll end up on the number line, I'm going to use my calculator. So when I take the square root of 2, I get 1.41, so on and so forth. That's why I have those 3 dots. Those 3 dots state that it goes on forever and ever, but it doesn't repeat. I'm not going to be able to write the entire number on the screen, so I'm going to just use those 3 dots. When I type the square root of 70 in my calculator and hit square root, I get 8.366, or 36, on and on and on, again with the dots. The square root of 36 is a perfect square, and that is 6. The square root of 21 is not, and I get 4.58, so on and so forth. The square root of 17 is 4.12, so on and so forth. And the square root of 63 is 7.933. So now that I've figured out all of my square roots, I'm now going to have to place them on the number line, because that is what the question asked me to do. So I'm going to start with letter A and the square root of 2. So I'm going to take my 1.41, I'm looking at my number line, and I'm going to put it somewhere between 1 and 2, probably closer towards the middle, but not quite, because it's not 1.5. So I'm going to go ahead and put a dot there on the number line, and I'm going to label that A, because we were talking about letter A. Could you write the square root of 2? Sure, but since they gave you the letter of A, that's the label I'm going to use. Then we're going to go to 8.36, so again, between 8 and 9, probably closer towards 8, and I'm going to go ahead and put a dot, and I'm going to label that B. The square root of 36 is 6. I can put that right at the 6 and label that C. 4.58 is between 4 and 5, a little bit past the 4.5 mark. So I'm going to go ahead and put a dot there and call that D. Square root of 17 is 4.12, so that's going to be closer to 4 than D was, and I'm going to label that E. And then I've got F is 7.93, so that's very close to 8, but not quite, and I'm going to go ahead and put my dot and label that F. So now I have all of my points labeled on my number line, and I've go ahead and completed this question. Let's move on to the next one. Now here in example B, we're talking about consecutive integers. And it says, between which two consecutive integers does the expression fall? So perfect squares are easy. When we had the square root of 36 in the last question, the answer was 6, and we were able to put that number right in the number line. However, not all numbers are perfect squares. So when we don't have perfect squares, we have to say between which two consecutive integers does that fall. So now we need to know what consecutive integers are. And consecutive integers are integers that follow each other in order, like 1 and 2, or 3 and 4, or 9 and 10. Those numbers are in order, they're consecutive, they're one right after the other, so those are consecutive integers. So we're talking about the square root of 20. We're going to go ahead and type that in our calculator, and when we do that, we know that it's going to be a decimal that gets us between 4 and 5. Now, we could type that in our calculator, get a decimal, and see if that decimal is between 4 and 5, or we could take a look at that number that's being square rooted and figure out between which two perfect squares it falls. So the square root of 16 is 4, so that's on one side, and this perfect square of 25 is 5, that's on the other side. 20 is right in the middle, so that we know that is between 4 and 5. I don't have to use a calculator to do that. I can type that in and get a decimal. That will work. That is a way to do the problem. However, it's a lot easier to just think about which perfect squares it is between. So the square root of 58 is between 7 and 8, because 7's perfect square is 49, 8's perfect square is 64, so 58 falls between those two numbers. 106, I'm going to square root that. That's going to be between 10 and 11, because again, 100 and 121. And the last one, the square root of 11, is going to fall between 3 and 4. Now that we've got all of our answers, let's move on to example C. Now here we are in example C, and it's to circle all the possible values for x in this inequality. So I have that x is less than the square root of x, or whatever number we're going to plug in there, is less than 9. So let's take a look. So I've got 6. Now is 6 less than 8? Yeah. Is it less than 9? Yeah. But I'm not looking for 6. I'm looking for the square root of 6. So I have to go ahead and type 6 in my calculator, hit the square root button, and when I do that, I get 2.44, so on and so forth. Again, those 3 dots represent that it's going on and on forever without repeating. However, 2.4 so on and on is not between 8 and 9, so that's not a correct answer. So let's take a look at 8.8. So if I type 8.8 in my calculator, is 8.8 between 8 and 9? Yes, but I'm not looking for 8.8. I'm looking for the square root of 8.8. So when I go ahead and type that in my calculator, I get 2.96, so on and so forth. 9.2, at this point I know 9.2 may be more than 9, but I'm not looking for 9.2, I'm looking for the square root of 9.2. So I'm going to type 9.2 in my calculator, hit that square root button, and when I do, I get 3.03 on and forever, and that does not fall between 8 and 9. So far we have no correct answers. Now 64 is interesting. If I hit the square root of 64, I get 8. So that's a perfect square, great. So you think, is 8 between 8 and 9? Well, 8 is not greater than 8, so it can't actually fall between 8 and 9 because it's exactly 8. So that is not a correct answer either. So now we've got to go on to 68. Again, I'm going to find the square root. I go ahead and type that in my calculator, 68, square root button, and I get 8.244 repeat, or on and on and on. And 8.24 does fall between 8 and 9, so it took us a while, but we did end up finding our first correct answer. So we're going ahead and circle that one as one of our correct answers. Let's move on to 73. 73, I'm going to go ahead and type that in my calculator, and when I do that, I end up with 8.54 on and on and on. And is that between 8 and 9? Yes, it is, so back-to-back correct answers for us. So let's go ahead and circle that one and move on to 81. Now again, I'm going to hit the square root of 81, and I know that is a perfect square. That perfect square is 9. So again, we run into the same problem that we ran in with 8. 8 is not less than 8, and 9 is not greater than 9 or less than 9. It's exactly 9. So it's not between 8 and 9, so it is not a correct answer. And finally, we're going to type 90 in our calculator, hit that square root button, and we end up with 9.48, going on and on forever and ever. and that is not between 8 and 9. So we only have 2 correct answers. Make sure that your paper matches mine, and let's move on to another practice problem. All right, practice number 2 says, which value is between 6 and 7? I want you to try this problem on your own. Go ahead and pause the video now, and then press play again to see if you get the correct answer. How'd you do? Did you get the answer correct? You should have figured out that the square root of 40 is 6.32 on and on and on forever and ever, and that number falls between 6 and 7. The square root of 36 is 6, that's not between. The square root of 49 is 7, and that is not between. So the only correct answer is the square root of 40. Let's move on to the next one. Here we are, we're talking about negative square roots. Wait a minute, I thought you said we couldn't have negative perfect squares. Well, that's true. We can't have negative perfect squares, but we can have negative square roots. So let's take a look at the 3 things that we have here. The first one says we have the square root of 9. When we see the square root of 9, we've seen that before, we know the square root of 9 is 3. That's easy enough. The next one, I have a negative symbol outside my square root. So I have to follow my order of operations here. I have to do my square rooting first and then apply the negative. So the square root of 9 is 3, and then apply the negative, so I get negative 3. And the last one, I've got a plus and a minus in the square root of 9. Huh, that's weird. I've never seen that symbol before. So what they're asking for there when you see the plus and the minus is they're asking for both the positive square root and the negative square root. Negative square root? Well, yes, if you had negative 3 times negative 3, you would end up with positive 9. So you can have a positive or a negative answer and still have the correct answer to the square root of 9. So when I see plus or minus the square root of 9, I need to know I have to have plus 3 and negative 3. I have to have both answers because it's asking me for both answers. If I don't see that symbol, you can assume that they're talking about looking for only the positive answer. But when you see that symbol, you need to apply both answers. Let's go ahead and try another practice problem. Here we are at practice number 3, and it says evaluate each expression. So I want you to go ahead through and try each one of these problems. Make sure to look for what symbols they're asking you for, write the answers in the boxes, and see how you do. Go ahead and pause the video now and press play again to see if you are correct. How did you do? Were you able to get all the correct answers? Were you making sure that if they gave you that little symbol, you added both the positive and the negative answer? If you did, great. If not, go ahead and make sure that your paper matches mine, and make sure that you have all of the correct answers. This brings us to the end of this video, so I hope that you enjoyed it. If you really liked it, go ahead and give us a thumbs up. If you really loved it, go ahead and throw us a subscribe. And we will see you in the next one.